slight indulgence while we try to get ourselves organised, which we've almost done. We have 3 of our 4 speakers sitting at the table, hoping the 4th will arrive. My name is Jonathan Wolff, Joe Wolff. I'm at the Blavatnik School of Government, and I'm delighted to introduce the speakers to you. I think I'll do that one by one, as we don't have all 4 to begin with. And our first speaker is Martin Conway, who is Professor of Contemporary European History here at Oxford. And Martin is going to speak to us on the topic of the reappearance of the people in European politics. And given the timing that we've got, I am asking speakers to try to restrain themselves to 15 minutes. 16, I'll begin to get nervous. So 20. Okay.
Thank you. You may think 15 is quite enough. We live in an age of liberal anxiety that I think was well expressed by Baroness Royal in her opening remarks. If any of you saw the front of the weekend section of the Financial Times on Saturday, it had a rather characteristic Timothy Garton Ash piece that was, he's a sort of last Macroniste in Europe, really, you know, emphasizing the need for a rational politics that rises above the populism of the crowd. And that sort of rhetoric of the fear, the precarious future of democracy, as Baroness Royal called it, seems to me to be very characteristic of our age. But some of us are old enough to remember that in many ways it wasn't quite like that 20 or so years ago. So there's a real historical phenomenon to explain here, which is the way in which we've moved from a relative confidence about history moving in the right direction, as Jan Royal said, to something where we think that history might be moving in rather another direction. This is not new. Look back to the middle of the 19th century, and many Europeans felt that they were living in an era of political fear and uncertainty and anxiety. And if they were in 1847, they were absolutely right. It was coming towards them. And I think that sense of living slightly before an upheaval that we do not yet know the shape of expresses very well, I think, a certain sort of rather ambient pessimism about the current political situation in Europe. Goodness knows whether it's founded or not. But what's interesting, and what I think we need to talk about in this conference, is the sense that actually that pessimism, that uncertainty, that nervousness has become part of our contemporary zeitgeist. Some of the reasons why, over the last 20 years, we've moved from a relative confidence to this mood of unease are, I think, so obvious that I won't spend time rehearsing them. Partly it's the fact that we live in something like the second decade of declining living standards in most of Europe. Some exceptions, some regional exceptions in Spain and Poland and so on, but this sense that actually a lot of people are living in an era when they don't feel that they are as prosperous as they were 10 years ago seems a fairly obvious reason for a certain sort of pessimism about the present, especially as because that era of the depression of living standards has been accompanied by a profound fragilization of living standards, arising from the extent to which various forms of security of economic activity in Europe have been fragilized by global economic change, but also by more national and local delocalization of businesses and the retreat of the state in the face of a certain, often quite uncontrolled reign of market forces. These are the forces that have rendered a lot of people's lifestyles very unpredictable, from farmers to small businesses, and they obviously they contribute to this era of pessimism. There's also been, most obvious point perhaps of all, the brutal transition from a certain sort of analog politics to a digital politics. The way in which the transition, the very abrupt transition to new forms of technology as the primary means of political communication in Western societies and now in global societies has in many ways taken away the structures, the channels, the transmission belts of political organization and rhetoric in European society, and have created what is a much more disconcerting, you could say democratized, but perhaps anarchized would be a better way of putting it, for structure of political debate. So much for the obvious. I want to spend the rest of my time, my 13 minutes, talking about some answers that I think are slightly more complex and interesting, and are ones that very much preoccupy those people who are moving towards trying to talk about what in a slogan we call a history of the European present, by which we mean a present that lies beyond the 20th century, because the project of researching and understanding the history of a short 20th century from the First World War to 1989 absorbed the best energies of previous generations of historians. But it seems to me that in the last few years we've moved towards a new project, which is understanding perhaps the new European society and politics that emerged after 2001, in which this issue of the people and this issue of a rather fragmentary and disrupted interventions of people into European politics has become a much more pressing and contemporary issue. Remember how things used to be, a particular model of limited democratic participation. It's a bit rude to use the word limited, but it was quite disciplined and restrained. It was based around universal suffrage, but about the primacy of parliaments, about the existence within those parliaments of multi-party systems that were sustained and vivified by structures of proportional representation, which ensured that any disruptive swings in electoral favour weren't automatically transmitted into the construction of governments. Instead, you had a fairly stable political class at the national level, but also in many European polities and then at the regional and at the local level. It's very difficult to try and kill off a Belgian politician. They might lose their parliamentary seat. They might then move to being bourgmestre, to being mayor of their city. They might then move into social and economic councils. There's a sense that they're never going to lose the chauffeur-driven car, as most Belgian citizens would point at. In other words, there's a kind of embeddedness of a certain sort of political elite that produced a certain sort of predictability. But that has gradually broken down over the last few years. And to take the case of Belgium, the two most successful political parties are now the Vlaams Belang, that traces its origins back to pro-German collaboration during the Second World War in Flanders, and the Parti du Travail de Belgique, which is a Maoist dissident movement from Leuven University in the 1970s that has become rather unlikely a principal spokesman of the underclass of disadvantaged Walloon cities in the 21st century. So this is the breakdown of a certain sort of predictability and a certain sort of discipline of democratic politics. And instead we have what political scientists often call challenger parties that have emerged on the left and the right. They have very different characteristics. They're loose coalitions. They're often rather temporary vehicles, often based around really rather personalised politics, whereby particular individuals seize a moment and try to ride a wave, and then also disappear. And Italian politics since the 1990s has been characterised, at least until the Meloni stabilisation, by the emergence of successive waves of those sort of personalised challenger parties, based above all on a rather improvised and loose ideology in which they don't actually have any serious fixed point, and they can move rather disconcertingly, as snobby observers will observe, from left to right in response to particular issues. And there is a name for this, and the name for this is, of course, populism. We saw the name of Kasmusa on the opening screen. You know, that is the sort of political scientist who has constructed very effectively a characterization of a new form of politics called populism. And it's a term that, of course, most historians love to hate, because they know that they can go back across the 18th, 19th and 20th century and they can find a whole series of people who were called populists in their time in a rather dismissive way. And historians know better than that. They know that in many ways what they represented was something slightly more profound and subtle than that, and above all, something much more differentiated and dissimilar. And therefore, a problem that a lot of historians have with the term populism is that it is a term that lumps people together. It's a term that creates a rather undifferentiated mass of parties in which all the nuances of national political cultures and of ideological schisms of left and right and secular and Catholic-inspired politics all disappears behind that awful thing, an ism. But it points, nevertheless, populism to an insurgent reality, an insurgent people whose norms of actions have clearly diverged from the norms of political action across much of the second half of the 20th century in Europe. It's associated often with things that verge upon violence or indeed break down into violence in particular moments, and perhaps more profoundly on a certain sort of lack of deference, not for social betters, but lack of deference for the formalities of the political system. And it's provided spaces for the emergence of new forms of male action, which might have existed in previous decades, but have in many ways gone into abeyance in much of Europe between the 1940s and the 1980s. And you get the new spectacle of really quite angry groups of predominantly men engaged in forms of direct political action for its own sake, without a larger purpose, but as the expression of emotional moods. And it is, of course, that change of the key of music of European politics into a new key of emotion, which seems to me to be one of the most profound aspects of this reality that lies behind the word, the emergence of populism, and how it finds its place within new sorts of social environments, particularly the rather chaotic and suburban realities of urban life in the 21st century, in what often get called rather glibly global cities. That's the reality, but it's also the perception which is interesting about this. Because the most interesting feature, in many ways, of thinking about this is the road journey we've taken from a very positive vision of the people that I would associate in my own lifetime, particularly in 1989, and the spectacle of a rather disciplined, sober, and educated crowd marching down the streets in Dresden or Prague or Budapest towards something which now looks much less positive to us. It's about the extent to which the dissidents of 1989 have been turned into the populist crowd leaders of 2025, the extent to which a certain sort of serious leadership of people who've even been to this university have been pushed aside in favour of people like Viktor Orban, who disguised the fact that he ever came to this university. This is a sense of freedom on the march being replaced by a rather dangerous and unpredictable volatility of crowds. And it has given space, of course, to a contemporary rhetoric that deplores the instances of racism and xenophobia and the emergence of what Baroness Royal called a certain sort of toxic polarised politics, based around rejection of the system that we might now associate with Trump, but in many of our minds in Britain we associate particularly with 2016 and the Brexit referendum. We the people, consequently, has become a problem or a threat. It's become the anti-rational ingredient in 21st century European politics. Anti-rational because it's incoherent, it's never going to pass an exam, it's not a joined up philosophy of politics, uncomprehending in the sense that, most insultingly, it often wears its history very lightly and doesn't really pay much attention to previous examples of European politics, and creates moral concern about the centrality of the memory of the Holocaust in 21st century European politics. And it's manipulable by rather obscure forces, occult forces, the power of the internet, the emergence of certain irresponsible centres of power in civic debate in the 21st century, the frauds of AI and the rumours of the internet. Out of all of that has been created a dominant rhetoric of the construction of an anti-popular politics. This is the point of refuge of many people who deplore populism, who see instead everything out there as being a new era of barbarian rule, and the attempt to try to defend, to construct, to create legal safeguards for a new sort of anti-popular politics, which doesn't worry about winning elections and certainly not winning referenda. When will be the next referenda within a European member state about membership of the European Union? I think that in many ways has been a lesson learned by a political class. So the real issue that I think we should be talking about here, behind the issue of the disturbing reality of a new form of unpredictable populist politics, is this other argument. Why did we ever think that history was going to be polite? Why did we ever think that there was going to be an easy transition to a new era? And why are we so denying of the democratic potential of the turbulent, disruptive politics of the last years? Why do we lack any optimism that this could arrive not at something that we personally would want, but at the construction of new forms of democratic participation in 21st century Europe? Because the people, I would suggest, have not ceased to be democrats. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Martin. Superb start.
How much was there? Sorry.
Yeah, and so there's,
I think I'll go for so I can see the slides.
fine. Okay. So let me introduce our second speaker, who is Aurelien Mondon, Professor of Politics at the University of Bath. And Aurelien will be talking about the construction of the reactionary people. And we have the slides, and do they work?
Yeah, they seem to be working. Yeah,
very good.
They are working. Good. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for the first presentation as well. I think it's going to link quite well to what I'm going to be talking about. And in fact, it's almost like we've planned it together, so it's quite nice. Thank you so much for the invitation as well. I really appreciate being here, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts about what I'm about to present. So what I'm going to be talking about today are things that I've been talking about for the last 15 years or so, and that I keep talking about, and I feel like I'm just repeating myself, really. But the more I repeat myself, the more obvious it seems as well, so maybe there's something in that. What I want to talk about today is not the P word that we've heard quite a few times already, populism, but the P word, the people, which is the title of this conference, which I think is a much more fruitful term than populism itself. A lot of my research has argued that the term populism, in fact, has diverted us away from thinking about democracy more broadly, the way we've already heard about. So this is going to link quite well, hopefully. So what I want to talk about really is the construction of a reactionary people. What I want to argue is that this reactionary people, which we generally subsume under the term populism, is very much a top-down construction. It is a fantasy in many ways that is created by elite discourse or through elite discourse. And what I want to talk about a little bit, or what I want to exemplify a little bit, is the construction first of the white working class and the left behind. This is nothing new, as Martin said. This, anyone who is interested in history, and I'm a political scientist, according to my title, but I'm also very much interested in history, and I don't think we can understand politics without understanding history, so I'm very much with you here. Anyone who's looked at history has seen many times the people being constructed in a reactionary manner. For example, if you've read David Roediger's book on the wages of whiteness, you will see how the American working class was consciously split after the Civil War to ensure that the working class wouldn't actually band together against property owners, so that the former slaves would not ally with the so-called white working class. But yet, we could argue that it was reinvigorated in 2016. I know it's almost 10 years ago now, which is quite crazy when we talk to first-year students in politics, that their life has been Brexit, their life has been Trump. So it's like it's forcing us to kind of think about these events that to us, maybe your people my generation and above, feel very new, are in fact already very much entrenched in the life of younger people. But this felt reinvigorated in 2016. With, of course, the Brexit referendum, or the victory of Brexit in the referendum, and the election of Donald Trump. And I'm going to give you one quote here, which I think illustrates very well the top-down construction of the reactionary people. And this quote is from Nigel Farage, whom you might have heard about. He's the guy in the golden elevator with Donald Trump, both of them, who apparently are speaking for the working class from their golden elevators with their millions and billions. So here's the quote, worth reading, I think, at length. The similarities, so This quote, October 2016, a few months after the victory of Brexit and a few weeks before the victory of Donald Trump in 2016. The similarities between the different sides in this election are very like our own recent battle. As the rich get richer and big companies dominate the global economy, voters all across the West are being left behind. The blue-collar workers in the valleys of South Wales, angry with Chinese steel dumping, voted Brexit in their droves. In the American Rust Belt, traditional manufacturing industries have declined, and it is to these people that Trump speaks very effectively. Thankfully, Brexit won, thankfully, Trump won, and therefore the working class in the valleys of Wales and the working class in the Rust Belt have nothing to complain about. Their income has risen tremendously, their voice is very powerful in Washington, and so on and so forth. Of course, it's hypocritical, right? Now, who would believe these two guys in their golden elevator would represent the interests of the left behind, the working class, whatever you want to call it, or the people? Well, very few people in the working class did believe them, but a lot of people in elite circles did believe them, on the other hand. Some of the research that I have done with Aaron Winter in particular has looked at the construction of the white working class. We've looked at electoral data for the referendum on the EU and also for the victory of Trump in 2016, 2020, and 2024. And what we found out was that by and large, Brexit and Trump in 2016 were wealthy votes. The lower you were in terms of income, and of course it's difficult to qualify class, but I'm qualifying it based on the surveys we got, the lower you were on the income scale, the less likely you were to vote for Trump or Brexit. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean that you were more likely to vote for Remain. The lower you were on the income scale, the more likely you were to abstain, to not vote. In the referendum, for example, in the US, the lower you were on the income scale, the more likely you were to vote for Hillary Clinton, an incredibly unpopular candidate that represented the establishment, who still won decisively in the bottom two sections of the income scale against Donald Trump. Biden did even better against Donald Trump in 2020. Donald Trump was by no means the vote of the working class. Maybe the vote of the older working class, but was working class 40, 50 years ago, but has a good pension, owns a house, maybe multiple houses, cars, and so on and so forth. But could these people still be considered left behind, working class, and so on? That's for you to decide. But as I said, the elite fell for it. The elite fell for the very words of Nigel Farage. Here is Newsweek. Is Trump's election on the revenge of the white working class? The Harvard Business Review, why the white working class voted for Trump. Don't get me wrong, many of my colleagues, political scientists, fell for it as well. We have the Washington Post, how Trump won the revenge of the working class whites in 2016. And my favorite, The Guardian, with an op-ed, how Donald Trump seduced America's white working class. Donald Trump, a hero to so many of the forgotten white working class. By who, I ask you? J.D. Vance in 2016. There you go. And of course, that was at a time when reactionaries were telling us that they were given no platforms by the mean liberal media, right? So there you go. So, as I said, this was blatantly untrue. Anyone who did basic research on opinion polling, and I'm not talking regressions, I'm not talking about fancy kind of statistics or anything like that. I said anyone, any journalist who would spend a few minutes looking at opinion polling would realize very quickly that this narrative is could be at least nuanced, and I would argue is wrong. So there's a construction here, that Trump is the voice of the working class, but Farage is the voice of the working class. Has that changed? Not at all. Think, for example, of the riots, the racist riots last year in this country. Here is a headline from the BBC. We are hardworking people. We are not far right. Fascinating coverage here. Since when do we listen to people attacking asylum seekers in hotels and let them decide the terms of a debate? Well, that's what the BBC does pretty much all the time. Remember, again, just over a year ago when the BBC apologized to Reform for calling them far right, even though it is possible to call Reform far right. I have many times in the news media, I haven't been sued yet, and I will continue to do so regardless, because after all, I can argue they are as an expert on the far right. But it's not just the BBC, it's also other newspapers, how economic grievances were exploited in Britain's violent unrest. You can see here again the idea that the people is upset at their economic precarity, and therefore that turns them into racist thugs. They are the people, we need to listen to them, and that's what we get with not only the Conservative Party that is moving rightward, but also the Labour Party that has been moving rightward. But you will tell me, but Aurelien, of course they are moving rightward. This is what the people want. Look at all the opinion polls telling us that immigration is a major concern for the population. Well, what I would argue is that you've fallen for a moral panic, much like our elite, our media elite, political elite. Let me just show you one quick graph. If you're interested in this, I can send you lots of articles that I've written and colleagues have written on these things. This is the Eurobarometer. That shows you, sorry, I don't know why it's going wrong here, but I'll explain in a second. This is the Eurobarometer survey. Yeah, it's done completely wrong, actually, this thing. So that should be a number of years from, I think, all the way to 2027 to, well, this is going to give you an idea. This is 2016, that you can see here. That's the Brexit referendum. So this graph shows you what are the two most important issues you are facing at the moment. In gray, in dark gray, it's two slightly different questions. In dark gray, what are the two biggest issues your country is facing at the moment? In light gray, what are the two biggest issues you personally are facing at the moment? The same people are asked these two questions, one after the other. And this is immigration. What you can see is when people are asked about their country, immigration is very high. But it also follows the news. The only time in the UK it is top as a major concern in the Eurobarometer is 2016. What happens in 2016? The EU referendum. What happens during the EU referendum? Immigration is the second most discussed issue across all of our media. It's the most headlined issue across the media, and it is predominantly discussed in a negative manner, as colleagues from King's College have shown very, very conclusively. So what we could argue here is like, is it discussed because that's what the people want? Or is it discussed because, or are people worried about immigration because it's discussed so much? Right? Agenda setting theory. What's fascinating about the Eurobarometer compared to the other opinion polling that we get, and although some of them have started doing it, I think Ipsos now is asking both questions since this year, is that they're asking according to you personally. And when people are asked according to them personally, this changes completely. People are concerned about education, about pensions, about jobs, about the economy, about health. And immigration is right at the bottom. Why is that? Well, there's no easy answer to that, right? But the point is like, why do we decide to focus on what people think about their country, which clearly they don't necessarily understand completely because it is always mediated? Whatever we think about our country, even me as a political scientist, as a so-called expert, I don't know all the ins and outs about the way a country works. I need to rely on sources of information. I need to rely on trusted voices, whether it be my workplace, my colleagues, whether it be newspapers, and so on. We have to as a society that is beyond the primordial village, as Benedict Anderson called it, right? And so this is a mediated vision at the top, and that's the one we rely on. And yet we blame the people for caring about immigration, which then forces our media to talk apparently more about immigration, which then forces our politicians to put these kind of things and to move to the right, even though reform has never really reached any more than 10% of the registered vote so far. So, what we've argued with Aaron Winter in particular, and what I would like to pursue today and in the future as well in my work, is that the use of class by reactionaries and its acceptance in mainstream discourse is not only counterfactual, but it has serious consequences. It constructs and racializes the working class as white against minorities and immigrants as if they were not part of the working class themselves. Again, this is completely fallacious. And when we think about, for example, the working class in London, which is by and large the most diverse class in our society, it constructs the white working class as privileging their racial interests above class ones. The only way they can fight back is by burning hotels with asylum seekers rather than actually going on strike or anything like this. It normalizes racism by painting it as a popular domain. Remember, we are not far right, we are just normal people, and so on. So just to give you an idea, again, to going back to the concept of the people, is who is worthy of democratic attention? Who is called the people in our elite discourse today? Well, just think about a few examples. The people's legitimate grievances, people burning hotels and singing racist chants. Look at, for example, Tony Blair urging Starmer to keep a grip on immigration to tackle the rise of the far right. If we don't, then populists will barge in because they speak to the deep emotional instinct of the people. But you can also, it's not just about immigration, it's also, of course, about other reactionary moral panics like trans rights, for example, as well, where, the New York Times, which is a liberal newspaper in the US, has to come to the defense of the left behind J.K. Rowling. You may not have heard of J.K. Rowling before. She wrote children's book, but she's been cancelled by the left. So yeah, she's completely disappeared. No one knows who she is today. On the other hand, the people who are not worthy of democratic attention are the elite. For example, the people who were in Bristol, which is near where I live, who were in Bristol, who were protecting that community after the racist riots, when more racist riots were planned. These 5,000 people were never called the people. They were never called the people who had legitimate grievance. The shopkeepers who were barricading their shops were not the poor left behind working class. No, no, no. The working class were these guys, right? It's not these people as well, but tens, the hundreds of thousands who've been demonstrating in the streets. It's not the people at Glastonbury over the weekend. They were just elite. They were just young, naive people, right? If you want to be called the people, the left behind, if you want to be worthy of democratic attention from our elite, you need to be racist, right? Anything below that will not get through. It's not young people trying to protest against for action for the climate emergency. No, no, no. And it's not the trans people themselves. They're not part of the people. The people are billionaires attacking already marginalized minorities. It's not groups of experts either. Groups of experts are again marginalized, as we can see even today, as the vote on the law on PIP and so on is passing or is going to be voted. And if this is something that we even hear on the left, people like Ash Sarkar, for example, that you might have seen maligned by the right-wing media, falls for the same kind of things, blaming identity politics as an elite concern. So what we need to ask ourselves is, of course, there is a democratic crisis, but what is the democratic crisis we're facing? Is it one where the people are turning towards authoritarianism, racism, and transphobia, and all matter of reactionary politics, and where the elite has no choice but to accept these democratic demands and throw their arms up in the air? Arms up in the air. It's not Starmer's fault if he's moving rightward. He has to. That's what the people want. Or is it a democratic crisis where knowledge is mediated, power matters in shaping the agenda and public discourse, and where the people is constructed in a top-down manner? So to conclude, if I have a minute, I do. What is to be done? Well, first, what I would argue is that we need to stop hyping and aping the far right. We need to stop exaggerating their size. We need to start thinking about turnout. We need to, whenever there's a by-election, look at the turnout, and you will realize that only 30% of registered voters turn up, right? So if 30% of registered voters turn up and 30% vote for reform, it means that 1 out of 10 voters in that constituency voted for reform. What about the 9 out of 10 who didn't? I'm not saying that if you force them, they wouldn't vote for reform, but the fact of the matter is they didn't, right? So why do we have to give it to Farage, that is the voice of a third of the population, like we did Marine Le Pen 15 years ago, like we did Jean-Marie Le Pen 30 years ago? Again, this has been argued many times. This is incredibly obvious. Some of my colleagues have said that for decades, and yet we keep falling for it. We need to stop platforming the far right. We don't need Nigel Farage to tell us he's not far right. Ask an expert. His politics are. That's it. Same, we don't need to platform Donald Trump necessarily all the time. We need to stop euphemizing reactionary politics. They are not populist. As Martin said, populism can mean different things, and at the end of the day, it kind of hides the politics behind actually what a populist is doing. If it's racist, we need to call it racist. If it's far right, we need to call it far right. Second, we need to stop blaming the people. We need to really think about power again. How is democracy shaped? And again, as Martin said, our democracies have always been very limited, and the role of the people has always been incredibly limited, and you know, choices have been always carefully curated. So we need to stop too easily blaming the people, and we need to focus on power. Who has the power to shape the agenda, to mediate? And finally, we need to start assessing honestly the role played by really existing liberalism and liberal elites in the rise of far-right politics. And this is really what I've been concentrating a lot of my research on lately, and what has taken me back to history as well. You know, this idea that progress is inevitable, the end of history, right? That took place in the early 1990s. This idea that slowly things would get better, women would earn as much as men, and so on and so forth. Right? But where does that history come from? As you've said, history has always been messy, has always been impolite, right? You know, liberalism has played a key role in some horrible politics, whether it is colonization and so on, right? So I think we need to assess that far more carefully, and we need to be careful with terms such as polarization, populism, and so on, because they might help us fight back against reactionary politics, but they also obscure I would argue, oops, sorry, I don't know what I've done, but I've done something else. They also obscure the possibilities beyond the liberal hegemony at the moment, and the fact that the liberal hegemony as it is today is not able to answer the mini crisis that we are facing. So very much like you said, I think we need to kind of put some faith back into the people, carefully of course, but I don't think we should discard the people as a concept either. So thank you.
Super, thanks so much. Can I just check again, do we have Isabel in the room? We do not have Isabel in the room. Okay, Luke, you've got a bit more time. You don't have to. We have plenty of time for questions, is it? Looks like. Thank you. So let me introduce the third speaker in our panel, who is Luke Bretherton, Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology here at Oxford. And Luke's talk is entitled Christianity in a Time of Populism. And we may have some slides. Great. Fantastic.
So huge delight to be with you. I'm not sure if this, I think it'll connect and some resonances and other kind of connections will emerge. So yeah, just a huge thank you to be here. I do want to say a quick apology that I can't stay the rest of the day. I've got commitments back at Christchurch. I've got to be out, but I'll be around for this morning. So I'm going to kind of go through the paper, and then hopefully in the discussion we can kind of explore connected themes and questions. So there have been various attempts to develop a comprehensive theory of populism. And much of this work takes a wholly negative view, seeing populism as deviant, peripheral, and a sign of democratic decay. Critics of populism see it as an aberration that, unless it is prevented or punctured, will poison the liberal democratic body politic. Against such a view, I contend that populism is an inherent and often benign feature of democratic politics. Yet, as with all forms of politics, including liberalism, as we've just heard, it can become toxic. The negative view of populism is prevalent in Europe and North America, where journalistic and academic work on populism is focused on the emergence of the far right and anti-immigrant parties and movements. But the scope of such work, I think, is parochial and historically myopic. It disregards, for example, as we heard Martin talk about, the populist nature of the third wave of democratic revolutions that ended communism in Poland, East Germany and Czechoslovakia, the apartheid regime in South Africa, and overthrew the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines. It also ignores phenomena such as the international peasants movement, La Vie Campesina, and it overlooks the ambiguities of a figure like Pim Fortuyn, in the sense of early harbinger of contemporary politics, who was the openly gay Dutch politician who was assassinated in 2002. He was a populist who adopted anti-immigrant and anti-Islamic stances in the name of defending tolerance and liberal democracy. Populism, I think, is not a specifically modern term or phenomenon, and neither is it solely Western. It is a perennial feature of forms of rule that include democratic elements. For example, there are populist movements in ancient Roman Republic, and unlike other political movements such as socialism, nationalism, or communism, populism is hard to pin down because a characteristic feature of populism is that it is ideologically open-ended, drawing on ideological frameworks to drive it. For example, a figure like Hugo Chavez in Bolivia used populist discourse, but his ideology was socialism. By contrast, parties such as the AfD in Germany use people to refer to a community of blood or race or a homogeneous conception of a shared Christian culture. They thereby align populism with racist and xenophobic ideologies. Also, unlike modern, mostly secularizing ideologies, populism can incorporate religious beliefs and practices. For example, The anti-communist revolution instigated by Solidarity in Poland in the 1980s drew heavily on Roman Catholicism. But as open-ended, populism is fluid, often changing tack and course. For example, 1 minute Geert Wilders in the Netherlands could be defending traditional family values, and the next he claims his party is championing gay rights. In short, populism merges with more established ideologies and discursive frameworks as part of a broader vision of restoring democracy and government to the people. The ideological indeterminacy of populism makes characterizing it along a left-right spectrum a conceptual mistake. Dividing populism between democratic and authoritarian forms, whether of the left or the right, is a more helpful way of distinguishing between different kinds of populism. Following the pioneering work of the political theorists Margaret Canavan and Ernst Lachlau, populism should not be seen as something inherently dangerous and thus as a phenomenon to be rejected, but as playing off tensions within democracy itself. For Canavan, populism is a contextual phenomenon that reacts to whatever is hegemonic. And in the context of modern liberal democracies, populism is an inherent possibility born out of the oscillation between what Canavan identifies as the redemptive and the pragmatic face of democracy. When democracy, which offers government of the people, by the people, for the people, its redemptive face, is reduced to a mechanism for negotiating and resolving conflicts of interest and distributing power, its pragmatic face, populists move on to the vacant territory, promising in place of the dirty world of party manoeuvring the shining ideal of democracy renewed. Or in the words of Donald Trump, it offers to drain the swamp. Building on Canavan, a constructive way to distinguish between different kinds of populism is to distinguish between a populist democratic politics and an anti-democratic forms of populism. A populist democratic politics attempts to construct a common life not by denying friend-enemy distinctions, but by a heightened process of conflict and conciliation, generating a richer sense of what is the good of the whole body politic. An anti-democratic populism refuses the possibilities of a common life, narrowing what is considered common by exclusionary and dichotomized visions of who is and who is not part of the people. Trump, with his identification of the good with only a limited set of people, is an example of this kind of anti-democratic populism. By contrast, a populist democratic politics embodies a conception of the politics that works to reinstate plurality and inhibit totalizing monopolies, whether of the state or the market, through common action and deliberation. We can use the example of the Occupy movement and the Arab Spring as examples of this. Anti-democratic populism seeks to simplify political space rather than render it more complex. It advocates direct forms of democracy like referenda in order to circumvent the need for deliberative processes and the representation of multiple interests in the formation of political judgments. The leader rules by direct consent without the hindrance of checks and balances or the representation of different interests. In anti-democratic populism, throwing off established authority structures is the prelude to giving over authority to the one and giving up responsibility for the common good. The goal of anti-democratic populism is personal withdrawal from public life, so as to be free to pursue private self-interests rather than public mutual interests that don't tread on me phenomenon in the States. In anti-democratic expressions of populism, personal responsibility is for the improvement of the self, one's immediate family or community, disconnected from the interdependence of any such project with the care of the public institutions, rule of law, physical infrastructure, and natural world that make up the commonwealth on which all depend. By contrast, democratic populism seeks to draw ordinary people into the care of the commonwealth and limit how much power either the state or private corporations have over shaping forms of common life. A typology can be, I think, constructed. Anti-democratic and democratic forms of populism do, however, I think, share the following. They both emphasize the need for strong leadership, dichotomize and simplify trivialize issues, advocate forms of direct rule, romanticize the wisdom of ordinary people, distrust universalist ideologies and the prioritizing of the global over the local, suspect theory envisaging themselves as pragmatic, distrust party politics, elites and bureaucracy, use effective rituals, symbols to generate a sense of unity, and mobilize through the organizing theme of ordinary people or non-elites as both the subject of grievance and the means of correction. However, I think critical differences between a populist democratic politics and an anti-democratic populism are fivefold. A populist democratic politics puts populist orientations and sentiments in the service of forging shared political space, not limiting it, subverting it, or closing it down for those judged other, either Muslims or immigrants. It invests in long-term organization and education. If you know the history of the populist movement from the 1870s to the 1890s in the States, they kind of pioneered, actually drawing on the Methodist circuit riders, the role of the lecturer who would connect different communities and points of learning. Or if you know community organising, such as the Industrial Areas Foundation or Citizens UK, the role of the organiser in connecting different communities and developing a shared democratic agenda. They develop a broad base of local leaders rather than relying on one charismatic leader and short-term mobilization of people who are focused not on loyalty to each other and a common life, but on loyalty to the single leader and the cause or issue. So, for example, occupies advocacy of leader-full organizations rather than the focus on the single leader in the phenomenon of MAGA and Trumpism. They frame proposals as moral imperatives, but at the same time see compromise as a key and beautiful word. That's a quote from Saul Alinsky, one of the founding figures of community organizing. They reconstitute the sense of what it means to be a people in a way that incorporates rather than demonizes those considered other. And then finally, it's committed to institutional diversity and the importance of civic institutions such as the church as independent of the state and or party rather than collapsing them into serving the party state. In short, populist democratic politics seeks to generate a common life as against a politics dominated by the interest of the one, the few, or the many. Populism corrupts the people when it claims to wholly identify the people with the interests of a part rather than the common. As a general rule, while populist movements can be democratic or contain strong democratic elements, populism as a regime of statecraft is rarely, if ever, democratic, as it quickly degenerates into forms of authoritarianism, even those that begin as strongly democratic movements. Now, at this point, I must sound a note of caution. Historical forms of populism can be democratic or authoritarian and often combine elements of both. For example, rather than being straightforwardly fascist, Peronism of the 1950s and 60s in Argentina and Huey Long in the 1930s Louisiana are both examples of the integration of democratic and authoritarian elements. Populism, as opposed to fascism, is thus an ambiguous political phenomenon. Moreover, unlike fascists, populists insist on the values of equality among the people rather than hierarchy and prioritize the community and right relations within it rather than the state and stable order. I turn now to reflect on all this as a political theologian, as befits my new office, I just started here in January, and as someone who's concerned for how the church should respond to populism, given that the church is mobilized across Europe as a key agent in far-right forms of populism. The first point is to recognize that Christianity has its own populist impulses, and populism trades on theological frames of reference in complicated ways. A populist impulse is a perennial feature of Christianity. It's born out of a sense that the renewal of relationship to God and the righteousness of the church come through direct, supposedly unmediated access to God. Arguments for direct access post the reading of Scripture, take the phenomenon of evangelicalism, or the work of the Spirit, take the phenomenon of Pentecostalism, in opposition to the rule of the church by educated elites, clerics, who put themselves between God and the people for example, the administration of sacraments in Catholicism, Anglicanism, and Lutheranism, etc. Theological and ecclesial populism generates opposition to clerical and political elites who are seen to usurp God and rule either in their own interests or serve idols, and thereby corrupt the people by leading them astray. The people of God need to be renewed by going back to what Scripture truly says, or a new movement of the Holy Spirit, or a return to moral purity and righteousness, conceived of in highly simplistic and legalistic terms, as in holiness movements down the centuries. This ecclesial populism can be mobilized in the service of far-right anti-democratic populist movements. Both the AFD and the Rassemblement National in France claim to represent Christianity, and in the same breath criticize leaders of the institutional church, and this is a quote from various AFD leaders as red-green filth, while also calling for stronger and more doctrinaire forms of church-state separation. This seeming contradiction makes sense when you realize that a key component of anti-democratic populism is that it is anti-institutional and claims for itself the direct representation of the people, in this case, the Christian people. And note, it is the Christian people, not the people of God. The institutional church and church leaders not only represent a threat to far-right populist leaders, as they insist on adherence to Christian teachings such as love of neighbour and all humans as made in the image of God, but also they claim to represent the people of God in society. Far-right anti-democratic populism wants to claim that role for themselves and envisions themselves as providing an unmediated access to and representation of the will of the people. We can see in anti-democratic populisms what I would call a Christophobic, anti-ecclesial and anti-clerical sentiment that pits the populists against the church in the name of representing the true Christian culture against the overly theological and woke forms of Christianity represented by elite church leaders. As well as having its own populist impulses that can be instrumentalized by the as well as having its own populist impulses that can be instrumentalized by populists, populist rhetoric draws on theological tropes. One is that they portray the people as having a messianic quality. The people, or a leader or vanguard acting in their name, can rise up to reinvigorate or redeem the body politic that is subject to corruption and dissolution. This redemption can either be backward or forward-looking in its gaze. In its retrospective forms, redemption involves recovering what was lost or stolen from the people by corrupt or indifferent elites or foreign powers. The campaigns for Brexit and Trump in 2016 were successful in leveraging this retrospective vision. In the case of Brexit, it was the sovereignty lost or stolen by the European Union. Lost to or stolen by the European Union. In the case of Trump, it was the greatness lost by those portrayed as politically correct elites and the racial, ethnic, and religious others they were taken to serve. In its forward-looking form, the people rise up to break a tyrannous and dominating power and found a new polity, which is to be a beacon of enlightened self-rule to all peoples. This forward-looking form is the foundation mythos of the American and French revolutions. After this founding event, populist movements retrospectively seek to recover the original moment of freedom and unity lost or stolen by present-day rulers, for example, the Tea Party discourses. Key to note here is how anti-democratic populists re-engineer theological speech and symbols to evacuate them of their creedal and ethical commitments. In short, Christianity is rendered into a wholly ideological identity, one that is paradoxically Christophobic and anti-ecclesial. One illustration of this dynamic is how a cross wrapped in a German flag is a symbol not of redemption, and not of the redemption of Germany in and through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, but the redemption of Germany by a Christian identity politics, or in Trump's case, save America. But the one doing the saving is Trump and his plutocratic helpmeets rather than Jesus Christ. What I've just said challenges, I think, dominant interpretive frameworks for making sense of the use of Christian symbols and discourses by populist movements, particularly in Europe, but also in Africa and the Americas. One frame of reference is represented by my colleague here, Tobias Kremer. Echoing many, he views far-right, anti-democratic populist use of Christian discourse and symbols as the secularization of Christianity for political ends, in a process that empties Christianity of its doctrine and ethics and converts it into a cultural identity marker linked to an exclusionary crusade. In this framework, what is seen is the continuation of secularization by other means, with the religious element explained away as merely exotic window dressing for the pursuit of imminent material and political ends. Another framework is represented by the work of Hannes Stroman and Ulrich Schmiede. They take the far-right, anti-democratic populist use of Christian discourse and symbols to be a revelation of a deep and abiding white supremacist logic at the heart of Christianity that needs exorcising. Here they draw on African-American political theologies focused on the situation in the States and apply it to the European context. Within this framework, what is seen is the continuation of Christianity, but in a more radicalized modality. On this account, theology is reduced to an exotic window dressing for racism, which is the reality that drives these movements. My contention is that both these frameworks marginalize questions of political economy and both ignore how democratic movements like Occupy and anti-democratic movements like MAGA are both reactions to the crisis of agency that modern systems produce. An alternative way to see the relationship between Christianity and far-right anti-democratic populism is as follows. The far-right anti-democratic populism does render immanent God talk and Christian symbols, but that does not mean that these are secularized. Rather, it represents the re-enchantment of the public sphere. In the European context, which I think is very different from Africa and the Americas, far-right anti-democratic populism represents a re-articulation of long-standing political theologies, notably those of Carl Schmitt, Charles Maurras, and Action Française. Like their antecedents, contemporary far-right anti-democratic populists create a sense of peoplehood and agency through polarizing against enemies. But rather than the communists, anarchists, and liberals of the 1920s and 1930s, today it is Muslims, wokesters, and the technocrats who are the perceived enemy. However, a key difference with the likes of Schmitt and Maurras is that they saw political ideas as secularized theology. Today's far-right anti-democratic populists see secular renditions of notions such as the nation or sovereignty in sacred terms. This represents a reverse flow, the enchantment of secular ideas rather than the secularization of theological ones, so that secular conceptions of nationhood and sovereignty are now sacralized into the register of political theology. The re-enchantment of politics by populists operating with an existential and cosmic frame rather than an immanent rationalistic one is highlighted by how the political conflicts of today are driven by political theologies. This contrasts sharply with the political conflicts of the 20th century, which were articulated through the secularizing high modern ideologies such as state socialism, communism, technocratic liberalism, and secular nationalism as it emerged from the French Revolution. Whether it is the shift from Ataturk's Turkish nationalism to Erdogan's Islamicist Justice and Development Party, or from the PLO to Hamas in Palestine, or from secular Zionism to religious Zionism in Israel, or the rise of the BJP in India, or the change from state communism to the political theology of Ruski Mir in Russia, what we see around the world today is a re-enchanted politics, but one where the secularized is now rendered in religious terms and mostly alienated from creedal and moral commitments. The paradox is that secularizing policies and practices meant to confine and defang religion created the material and social conditions for the emergence of a de-tradition, disembodied and alienated sacred. As Kremer's and other research suggests, where people are still embedded in traditional and institutionally mediated forms of religious belief and practice, they are more resistant than the general population to the siren call of authoritarianism. To return to Europe, far-right anti-democratic populism in Europe today is a political theology enchanting the public sphere over and against its disenchantment by both technocratic and progressive neoliberalism. In doing so, it is drawing on resources available within Christianity, but in ways that turn these frameworks, emotions, rituals, and symbols against the church and against the person of Jesus Christ. So we end up with a paradoxically anti-Christic Christianity. And I'm going to speak in an explicitly theological register now. In theological terms, what is happening is a rather prosaic, but in ways that turn these frameworks, emotions, rituals, and symbols against the church and against the person of Jesus Christ. So we end up with a paradoxically anti-Christic Christianity. And I'm going to speak in an explicitly theological register now. In theological terms, what is happening is a rather prosaic and straightforward case of idolatry. Either an idolatry of the nation as a replacement Christ, or the idolatry of a demagogic figure as a replacement Messiah. Either way, it is trading off Christological tropes, but in a way that is equally haunted and horrified by the figure of Jesus Christ. On a theological reading, the challenge to confront is the perennial question of how to form a people, the people of God in the case of the church, who define their identity not by political ideology or cultural identity markers, but through love of God and love of neighbour, which includes love of neighbourhood, and the ways in which this love makes possible forms of common life with strangers and enemies. This struggle is one that demands overcoming false gospels and salvation narratives about what will redeem the people. It is also a struggle that entails countering anti-humanistic forces that want to desecrate the image of God in others, not like them, in order to secure themselves in the world. This struggle must challenge those who seek to secure themselves and their way of being in the world through the domination of others, the libido dominandi that Augustine named so well. The heart of this struggle is the need to convert the earthly city into a peaceable and penultimate place all can call home, to return to politics as a means of neighbouring rather than looking to politics, as I think anti-democratic populists do, as a means of salvation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Luke. We will be taking Q&A in a moment. We have a microphone. I would urge you to use the microphone because we're being streamed, and if you don't use it, then no one will be able to hear you online. Before we do that, I just want to ask whether the panelists have any comments or questions for each other, as we do have a bit of extra time now. No need, but if there's anything bursting.
Well, I thought we were very agreed with each other, didn't we? In a rather pleasing way.
Well, let me take the question. So, hand just come up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. Naomi Wilson-Smith, I'm now here at Oxford, and my apologies that I also have to take off quickly, hence my hand going up quickly. I wanted to ask our speakers a little bit more about the role of political economy, and specifically the role of the neoliberal consensus between centre-left and centre-right parties on that reactionary construction of the people, constructing the people, as we might say, as a false totality that is primarily exclusionary. I think I heard Martin refer to the retreat of the state in favour of market forces, but we also know some scholars, people like Alberto Toscano, making the argument that in fact neoliberalism is the use of state power in the service of certain interests of capital, precisely to immunize the state against popular egalitarian demands. I'm also thinking about Quinn Slobodian, talking about it as a front lash within neoliberalism, not a backlash of the far right. Also the work of people like Bonquet and Bourgeron on the Brexit campaign as being a struggle between two sections, two fractions of finance. So I wondered whether each of our speakers, I suppose, touched on very, very briefly this question of neoliberalism, whether any of you might have something to say a bit more about how that has played a part in constructing a notion of the people.
Thank you. So who would like to respond? Go in reverse order, Luke. Yep.
No, I think it's a fantastic question and a really important point. And in entirely agree with many of the figures you've just cited. I mean, to put it in very basic terms, I'm kind of taken by Karl Polanyi's famous thesis of the origins of fascism as born out of the crisis of capital, and that you can't live a life when your nature, your body and money is all turned into commodities. And so then you either, I think there are only two responses at the kind of liquidization of life. There's either a democratic response to recover agency. We see that in the rise of the labour movement and other parallel democratic movements. We could look at the rise of things like Occupy and others as a similar move. Or there's an anti-democratic, and you look to a party or messianic figure to stabilise the world for you. But they're kind of responses to the liquefaction and the kind of hyper-precarity we're seeing generated. And so I think the paradoxical way in which someone like, what's his name, funder of GB News, he's a hedge fund guy, a big backer of reform. No, not banks.
Another of them,
yeah. Anyway, you know what I mean. Paul Marshall. So you've got figures like him and Farage himself, who are coming out of a neoliberal elite, looking to kind of secure the state to secure their interests. Others who would be opposed to kind of classic globalist things. So there's kind of conflict within the holders of capital about the response. But I think this question of the crisis of agency under the rubric of neoliberalism is what is driving. And I think this makes me wary. While it's undoubtedly a factor, I'd slightly push back against what some of Aurelien was saying. I think, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but I've been teaching the States for the past 13 years at Duke, and I encountered a lot of this in my colleagues in Duke. The tendency towards a race reductionist view. Now, I'm not saying you have a class reductionist view, but I think that reducing it all to white supremacy marginalizes bigger question of political economy.
No, I think that's a good point, and just to be clear, that's not what I was saying at all. And I think political economy is absolutely central, but I think white supremacy also, as Bell Hooks was talking about, is also core to kind of patriarchy and capitalism as well, right? So I think all of this is kind of subsumed in a way in what has been called by other colleagues racial capitalism, for example. But I think, to go back to your question, I think it's a great question. I think it's absolutely central, and I think what's fascinating about it is that we don't really talk about it in our public discourse. We in fact divert attention onto issues that are non-issues, that are issues for no one, bar the people who again set the agenda in our mainstream media. Immigration, for example, as I showed, when you ask people about their day-to-day lives, they don't care about immigration. They care about political economy. They care about pensions, education, because they want their children to do well. Cost of living, all of these kind of things, right? And I think in a way what's happened is, because I don't think it's necessarily conscious, I don't think it's a big conspiracy or anything like this, but I think what has happened is we've really kind of internalized the end of history narrative, even though it was very quickly debunked. Even Fukuyama himself didn't believe in it for very long. But yet we've internalized it so much that, as the kind of quote goes, and no one really knows who said it first, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And of course,
Jameson, my colleague.
Well, I don't know. There's debates about that, but yeah. That's why I didn't want to create a scandal and say and give a name. But and I think that's a bit tried and that's a bit cliche. I know how to say that, but I think it's quite interesting in a way. But I think what I'm interested in my work is who speaks for the people and who do we let speak for the people. The fact that we allow Marshall, that we allow GB News to speak for the people, that we allow Farage, Trump, Musk. Elon Musk speaks for the people, the left behind, is going to create a new party apparently because Trump is not speaking for the people well enough. I mean, it's mind-blowing, and but they're trying to do that themselves, I understand, because that's how democracies work, but that we're allowing them to do that the people who are supposed to be the institutions protecting democracy are allowing them to do that. I think shows us that we need really to move past this idea that liberal institution and really existing liberalism is going to be a bulwark against fascism, because what we've seen, again, if we look at history, is that, liberalism has been able to accommodate fascism, or thought it would be able to accommodate fascism, or to even use fascism to counter to counter other forms of revolutionary politics. So that's why I think we need to go beyond that idea. It doesn't mean that we need to discard liberalism, but we need to think beyond it and see actually what we need to do to actually provide alternatives to the many crises we're facing, because at the moment, neoliberalism that we've internalized isn't an alternative, clearly, and is not working.
Yes, I mean, I stand corrected. I slipped through a rather stupidly simplistic definition of neoliberalism as being about the retreat of the state. No, it's about the redefinition of the state as being a particularly strong institution that plays this guardian role in terms of setting a set of rules for society, and that is the version of neoliberalism that one sees reflected in the actions of various self-regarding elites or spokespeople for neoliberalism in contemporary Europe. But there is a different neoliberalism, isn't there? Which is much more what one saw in the 1970s and 80s, which was about new levels of European society accessing micro-capitalism and engaging in what they thought of as being self-liberating forms of redefining their futures, of taking themselves outside of a predetermined future, a future determined by family background or by levels of education, or simply by the community within which they were lived, and seeking out new forms of opportunity. And I think we risk condemning far too many diverse forms of behaviour just through the recourse to GB News and all that as a particular version of neoliberalism. I think for historians what will be much more interesting is the book that probably remains to be written about the democratization of capitalism as a form of social practice rather than as an economic system in Europe in the later decades of the 20th century. It will be an incomplete book because the story is an incomplete one, and in many ways it's also then about the recapture of capitalism by the energies of particular globalizing institutions and companies and financial sectors. But I think there's something quite interesting to do there about the way in which the space that we don't want to call populism also had that sort of political economy element that went alongside the more political themes that we've talked about today.
Thank you. So I think, gentlemen, we've got a microphone. And if you could follow the great example of the previous question by introducing yourself.
Yes. Hi, Joe. Javier Zataka. I want to ask a few methodological questions, especially Professor Mondon. You reached a rather counterintuitive conclusion that populists are a small, well-off minority. And that makes me think a little bit about the assumption. Assumption number one, people who don't vote populist are anti-populist. Whereas there are two reasons to think that this is not the case. When you don't vote, it's a kind of vote of lack of confidence in the democratic process, or you just don't care. Secondly, empirically, Elon Musk's help for Trump was exactly with these infrequent voters. They generated algorithms to reach them, to get them out, and then indeed, when they got them out, they voted usually for Trump. Number two, you seem to base too much of your evidence on the 2016 rather than the 2024 elections. Indeed, the poorest Americans voted in 2016 for Hillary Clinton, not necessarily because they were poor, but because, unfortunately, they tend to be African Americans. It was a racial vote. On the other hand, in 2024, the United States had the most equitable election in quite a while. That the vote for Trump or for Kamala Harris did not show very much demographic variations. People across the board, across age groups, education groups, tended to vote not the same, but more the same than we have had it for a very long time indeed. Finally, the kind of assumption that that there is a kind of a vote of the working class, which is kind of nostalgic. We haven't had a working class in a while, haven't we? What we have is people are tendentially connected with the economy, gig workers, sometimes work, sometimes don't. And these people seem to relate, to J.D. Vance's origin story. That's this kind of precarious existence that he indeed utilized throughout his life to get ahead, and then try not to anymore. Just this kind of method. seems, you know, it's a counterintuitive result, which makes me suspect there's a little bit of cherry picking of the evidence.
Well, there's a challenge.
Yep. I mean, I'm happy to send you various articles by me, colleagues, and with colleagues and other people as well, so you can see all the evidence. I mean, just to take the points one by one. First, I don't call them populists, so that's the first point of contention. I'm talking about far-right or reactionary politicians, which is a very big difference, I would argue. And yes, I would argue that they're generally well off. There might be a few exceptions, but I can't think of any right now that would be particularly prominent in the cases I look at, to be honest. So Trump in 2024 did not. I don't think he did necessarily better. I think he won because the Democrats lost it in many ways, which is very similar to 2016, although the results are different and the statistics are different. There's a very interesting, actually, research that's come out by Pew, I think, if I'm correct, last week, or maybe even this week, maybe last week, I think, that actually shows the transfer of votes between 2020 and 2024, and what really kind of swayed it is the fact that a lot of people who voted for Biden, particularly in the kind of lower sections in terms of income, but also in terms of ethnicity, for example, shifted towards abstention, and that kind of lasted for Kamala Harris. But I don't think it's to do much with Trump as much as it is to do with the Democrats really bottling it, I would argue, for various reasons that we can talk about if you're interested. So in a way, yeah, I do look at 2016 because I think 2016 is a turning point, right? And I think a lot of what has followed from 2016 takes its roots far before 2016, as I said earlier on. But I think 2016 is a key turning point that ended up setting the narrative for the following years. You know, you could even think, for example, of 2020 when Biden is elected. He talks about reconciliation as soon as he's elected. After a campaign that led to the coup in January, or the attempted coup in January. It talks about reconciliation, and I think already we could see the whole democratic project unravel here, where the people who had been voting for Biden, not necessarily because they were sold on his program, but because they were scared of what would be happening if Trump was re-elected, felt utterly betrayed because the politics that had threatened them, that had threatened their democracy, their institution, they were told to reconcile themselves with them. So I think there's something to it here about the Democrats really, I think, using this election. With regard to the working class, you're absolutely correct. I entirely agree with you. It's very hard to talk about a working class today. I don't think we should necessarily not do it. I think we could do it, but I think it would take a lot of work. The way I define the working class here based on income is inaccurate. That's not the way I would define it myself. That's the way it's defined in public discourse broadly and in elite discourse. The question, though, that I think is more interesting is why do we keep talking about the working class? And particularly, why do we keep talking about the working class only when we talk about reactionary politics? We very rarely talk about the working class when we talk about other issues. But we talk about the working class when it's about riots, when it's about insurrections, when it's about Trump, when it's about Brexit, when it's about Marine Le Pen. So who is that useful for, this working class? That is fantasized, that is mythologized. I agree with you, but this construction, this working class might not be real, but the impact of that construction of the working class is real. And I think this is what I'm looking at, and maybe I've gone over this far too quickly, but I'm happy to send you more stuff on that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, gentlemen, here, the microphone's just coming.
Thank you all very. Is this on? Yes. Thank you all so much for your presentations. And my name is, yes, my name is Mark Lusto. I'm affiliated with the Institute for the Study of Minorities in Romania. And I actually want to ask about Romania very quickly. I noticed that two of the speakers kind of in talking about the populist revolutions of 1989 listed off a number of countries that had been behind the Iron Curtain, including Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Romania was, at least to my mind, conspicuously left off of both of your lists. I just want to know if that was just an accident. These are sort of throwaway lines sometimes. But there's a specific intent behind that question, which was that sort of to interrogate one of the themes that seemed to revolve around or emerge from that understanding of the 1989 revolutions, which was that these were sort of states of grace, almost like these were Edenic moments, and that we've experienced a falling away into sin after the pure ideas of these revolutions, of these populist movements, have been deformed, degraded, debased by their by their successors, for instance, Viktor Orban in Hungary. In Romania, in contrast, there was never a sense of Edenic purity about the revolution that happened in 1989. It was violent, it was brutal, it really scrambled understandings of right and left about who was on the good side and who was on the bad side. It permanently disrupted an alliance between intellectuals and the working class. There was never, I don't think anybody from Romania would ever say, well, it was an Edenic moment that somehow has been debased and used for nefarious purposes. So I wonder if you would engage with that kind of arc of the story that you're telling about these revolutions and populism.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of was deliberate. I wouldn't put Romania in the same class as the movement in Czechoslovakia or Poland, which were very, very explicitly trained into as non-violent direct action movements. And actually, I've witnessed all three of those in person, and they had very different feels to them. And I would put Romania much more in line with the kind of developments that took place in the former Yugoslavia, and the conflicts between the Hungarian minority and the Romanian majority were right there from the beginning, and real anxieties there and how that connected to developments in Hungary. However, I will say, I think in all of those movements across that kind of so-called third wave, and I would include South Africa in this, there were both impulses, a kind of authoritarian impulse and a democratic impulse, which come to different versions of that come to fruition later down the line. So just take the example of Slovakia. You had the rise of a figure like Mečiar very quickly claiming, was the joke in Slovakia in the 1990s, is kind of had a Christian Democratic Party and they were neither Christian nor democratic. But you saw in a figure like that an anticipation of the current moment. Here was a demagogic figure, kind of, you had the takeover of state industries by a kind of apparatchik class claiming to represent the people. You had the death of the European Marxist project, so a kind of collapse of a secular utopian future and the influx of every religion under the sun. And within that, a figure like Mečiar rises, and you could look at Milosevic and others, who kind of takes up those energies and doesn't have an explicit ideology. It's a kind of vague amalgamation or switch from left to right, defends the interests of capital very strongly, and the kind of interests of farmers and others over and against a seemingly intellectual urban elite. And so, yeah, I think you see in that moment, in a sense, a prefiguration of the politics we currently live within, where you had a kind of failure of a state project, failure of a certain secular utopian future, and the rise of high concentrations of power. And I think in somewhere like Romania, that was all present there in the kind of origin moment. And so it's a much more ambiguous one than something like the movement in Slovakia. But I mean, the movement in Czechoslovakia, but as we saw, Czechoslovakia very quickly split, and all of those impulses came out very, very quickly. So yeah, I don't have it as a kind of Edenic moment, but I think there were very, very intentional, very explicit traditions of democratic movement building committed to non-violence. And I think you can trace across that period those which were led by those who've been formed through those kinds of commitments and those who weren't.
Yeah, well, Romania is normally the future, and it certainly is at the moment, because it personifies what I was trying to convey in terms of the amalgam of the old and the new that one sees in the contemporary democratic structures of Europe, which seems to be neither populism nor some sort of liberal Edenic moment. In fact, what you get is a very disrupted transitions in Romanian politics over the last 30 years through a series of rather individualized leaders, through disengagement of people from voting, very low turnouts in elections in both Romania and Bulgaria in recent years, spectacularly low in Bulgaria. You know, there's clearly an ethnicization of political discourse going on, and there's clearly the presence within political discourse of a whole series of possibly unattributed occult forces in terms of the sudden emergence of particular leaders at particular moments. This is all a recipe for a Gartenaschian sort of pessimism about the future of the 1989 revolutions and so on. I think I'm trying to say that probably, along with what you were suggesting, that there never was that particular moment, at least in Romania. And what's really interesting is the extent to which, despite all of that, we don't have anything that looks particularly like a dictatorship in Romania. And we have, of course, a really rather vibrant, noisy civic discourse going on. It doesn't always win, but it's about trying to articulate different versions of Romanianness, which I think is quite, it's not going to be optimistic about it, but I'm going to say that there's something here that needs to be taken a little more seriously than just to see it all as a reactionary crowd marching down the street shouting anti-Semitic slogans reinvented from the 1930s.
Thank you. Yes, please.
My name's Joanna, and this I'm going to make a comment which is partly about locating myself in relation to some of the themes of the conference, and it's going to end with a question for Aurelien. So for 20 years I've been co-directing a collaborative history project which is about thinking about how democracy became a modern political concept, one used to think about the modern world in the course of the 19th century across Europe and the Americas. That's basically what we do. So my perspective on these topics comes from that 19th century perspective. But maybe I'm interested in the 19th century perspective partly because that's some of the way I might see the world anyway. Now, populism isn't really a category in the 19th century. I mean, it appears as the name of a specific American political movement at the end of it, but with the name of a movement rather than the category for a whole phenomenon. And the ground now occupied by populism is really occupied by democracy in the 19th century. So I find sectioning off part of this very complex political phenomenon that we call democracy into populism a hard thing to do. And linked with that, I find it difficult to use democracy normatively. I think it's actually quite hard to think about democracy if we've decided in advance it's a good thing, and we can only use the term for things that we approve of, and when we disapprove of them, then they have to be something else. And maybe we should take a more warts and all approach to democracy, and it has some good features and some problematic features and can generate all kinds of results. So I also have a problem, so here's something that Luke might want to respond to. That's not an attack on him, with the idea of anti-democratic populism. And I think that's partly because it seems to obscure questions of agency, which I think Aurelien's been interested in. I mean, who's making this populism anti-democratic? That's what seems to me to be occluded in formulations like that. Though also I think I'm doubtful of, and I think exclusivity is to some degree a feature of pretty well all political movements. The idea we've got just inclusive ones that everyone's welcome in, and others which are exclusive and people out, also seems to me there are questions of degree here, but we shouldn't idealise the ones we're calling inclusive too much. So that's a set of observations. In particular, might want to respond to that last one. So in that spirit, I liked the generally kind of concept-busting approach Aurelien was taking. Let's not use the concepts that are out there so much, but come up with some new ones which might capture these things we're thinking about in unexpected ways and allow us to see them afresh. But what he didn't bust was the left-right dichotomy. On the contrary, that remain very important to your analysis. Far right is what you want to call the people who otherwise call populists. And I would be interested to hear more about why you think that sort of binary is surviving the changing political conditions of the 20th century, and whether that is to any extent rooted on empirical work about how people's attitudes cluster, and if so, if the clustering might also give us a perspective on the content we should give to left and right.
Thank you very much. Should I? Yeah, thank you so much. That's lots to think about. We have a few hours, right? I mean, on your comment, during my PhD in particular, which is a while ago now, I did quite a lot of work on the history of populism as well, and I've been thinking about the 19th century and how it kind of like played out in what you were talking about, like the mid 19th century, and whether we could kind of think about kind of proto-populism almost. And the closest I got to
Napoleon. Yeah.
No,
right?
not.
Caesarism is a concept that is around.
Yeah, not.
It does some of the work.
To me, it was Boulanger really.
Oh, Boulanger.
Yeah,
a generation later.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, to me it was Boulanger in the early 1870s, I guess, or late 1870s in France. That came closer, but I never ended up writing about it, so I don't know. But then there was the Russian case, which was again interesting, which I think throws another spanner in the work. You know, the Narodnitschadstvo, pardon my pronunciation, which again, yeah, is all very interesting. But I think your point, I think, about democracy is also very, very interesting, about warts and all of this. And I agree entirely with you. I think we can be normative about democracy. I think that it's probably better that we have a democracy than not, right? But I think we have, again, limited ourselves in our understanding of democracy to the understanding of liberal democracy or representative democracy, which is incredibly narrow, again, incredibly limited, as you said. And I think that has prevented us from thinking more broadly about actually things that could help us. Even very moderate kind of reforms would really help reinvigorating our public discourse, which is in a dire state at this stage. So I totally agree with you. I think finding a completely inclusive democracy is probably utopian, but I think thinking about a more inclusive democracy, I think, is probably worthwhile. And I think that's where the left-right dichotomy comes in. And in the last couple of years, I've moved away from using just far-right, because I think I have a fairly precise definition of what I mean by far-right, but I think it's also limited to maybe almost a period of history that is ending. And I think we're facing something slightly different now. That's why I'm using reactionary politics today, which I'm working on defining more precisely. I build on the work of others. For example, Corey Robin, who's written a great book called The Reactionary Mind. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I think it's a great kind of like starting point. And what I find interesting about reactionary politics as opposed to far-right politics is that it, in a way, takes into account what you were talking about before, about the potential reductionism of focusing just on racism. Because I think today reactionary politics are far broader than just racism. I think racism is still very much core and racial capitalism is core. But I think crucially, where reactionaries have been much better than the traditional far right in politics has been to kind of hijack many potentially progressive concepts, and including liberal concepts. So with Aaron Winter, we've done a lot of work on liberal and illiberal Islamophobia, on liberal and illiberal racism. More recently, with my colleague Fran Emery, I've done some work as well on liberal and illiberal transphobia as well. And what we're arguing in a way is that we need to understand reactionary politics in an intersectional manner. It's not just about racism, it's not just about misogyny, it's not just about transphobia, it's about all of them together. It's not just about class, it's about all of them together. Because if you leave one out, then you can end up playing into their hands. For example, we've seen that in France with the debates on laïcité, where so-called kind of like this kind of so-called progressive concept of laïcité, the separation of church and state, ended up kind of preventing women from wearing whatever they want. I wouldn't call that necessarily feminist politics, but there you go, the French do. So I'm French, I'm allowed to say it. So yeah, I think this is why I've kind of moved on in a way to kind of calling them reactionary politics, to kind of really put intersectionality at the core of this understanding, I think. And this is where I think the left-right kind of dichotomy is still relevant, I think. And this is where I think we can revive that dichotomy, which I think is important in politics, by ensuring that if we want a serious opposition to the right, to reactionary politics, to authoritarianism, and to what I think can increasingly call fascism, we need something that's intersectional, and that could be called the left, but again, in a broad sense, right, not in a prescriptive one.
Yeah, I mean, I think I take your point. I would want to defend a very, very, very strongly a normative account of democracy. And I think, and the use of something like a notion like anti-democratic, precisely building what Aurelien was saying, we overly conflate democracy with liberal democracy and as a particular regime of statecraft involving elections, independent judiciary, independent civil services kind of stuff. Now, I think those are good things, should be defended, but my conception of democracy, you might call it everyday democracy, I have a very basic working definition. Democracy is the notion that people should have some say and agency in determining their living and working conditions, whether that's economic democracy in the firm or in the neighborhood or your country you happen to live in. Now, on that kind of account, and we could look back to figures like Sheldon Wolin or Hannah Arendt or all sorts of other figures kind of theorizing that. On that kind of account, the move to have anti-democratic policies, i.e. the giving over of agency away from people to the algorithm and Musk, or to, that's what Doge is about, the deeply anti-democratic move, the kind of technologization of the mechanisms of statecraft, or to the messianic figure in a Trump, or these are clearly on normative and empirical grounds anti-democratic because they are taking away agency from ordinary people in determining their living and working conditions.
So it wasn't anti-democratic, but anti-democratic populism.
Yes, yeah, and so, yeah. Now, in relation to your broader point, democracy is an inherently sectarian entity. We, the people, means not them, not them, not them. So I don't take, democracy has that sectarian impulse. But here's the thing, and this is a point someone like Sylvia Winters makes in relation to the emergence of notions of humanism in Europe, but I would say it's there from Diogenes the Cynic back in ancient Greece. It's always post-cosmopolitanism, of which liberalism as a variety is the answer to a democratic sectarian impulse. And so there's a conflict between liberalism and democracy in that sense. Universalizing discourses or ideologies can never recognize that they too create friend-enemy distinctions, to use kind of Schmitt's terms. There's always if you're the Soviet man and woman, you're not the capitalist, if you're a liberal, educated so-and-so who went to Oxford, it means you're not the wicked people who should know better than to be ruled by kind of liberal technocrats. So every universalism operates with a friend-enemy distinction. The idea that cosmopolitanism is the answer, is an inherently inclusive politics, is magical thinking. It's nonsense. And so we need to be very self-critical of the inherent constructions of exclusion of every discourse. And how I do think, though, normative accounts of democracy are a kind of critical astringent against those ways we render myopic, render ourselves blind to the inherent exclusions built into all of our discourses.
Thank you. And so, Marco Simonelli. Managed to turn it off. Okay, Marco Simonelli, University of Barcelona. Many thanks to all the speakers. Probably the question is a general one. I don't know whether it's more directed to the first two presentations, but however. My question concerns the etiquette of populist. I mean, I was thinking that probably one of the defining components of populism is this anti-establishment attitude. But if we frame this anti-establishment attitude in broader terms, we can see that this anti-establishment attitude is translated into the denial of everything that is flowing from liberal capitalistic society. I mean, what Naomi Klein was referring to as the mirror world. This part of an increasingly bigger part of society who is refusing everything that is flowing from mainstream newspaper, from television, from everything that is official. Though this part of society who believes in conspiracy theories, great reset, great substitution, this part of society who denies scientific evidence. I mean, so when we are looking at this part of society, how it is appropriate to refer to this part of society as populist politics. And do you see any coincidence between these two parts of society? Thanks.
Thank you. So who would like to go? Martin?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting reflection, isn't it? You can go all the way from sort of the mad ravings of a certain sort of NSDAP in the 1920s about how Germany lost the First World War. It was really just a plot by America or whatever, to the sort of anti-vaccine campaigns of the 2020s via a whole series of other campaigns. And you can say that actually what unites these forms of politics is a particular distrust of experts. And Michael Gove's famous phrase in Britain, "We've had enough of experts," during the Brexit campaign, resonates through British political culture for the subsequent years. That's probably a form of anti-establishment discourse, which can certainly incorporate all sorts of versions of left and right politics, and it's very deeply embedded in a whole tradition of anarchist politics, I think, in Europe across the 20th century, less so in socialist communist politics. Is that interesting? Does that matter? Is that important? I think it's a rather secondary element of populism, or, you know, I don't want to use the word populism, do I? It's not. It's a rather secondary element of these forms of politics. Yes, of course, they are distrustful of elites and of establishments that they think are, in some respects, and absolutely rightly, not in favour of them, and therefore they resort to these alternative forms of information, which the internet has probably provided more of that than was ever the case, but it was certainly always there. So for me, the tendency of these movements to resort to unreliable explanations, the tendency of them to resort to unreliable rumours and to frankly fanciful explanations, the sort of things that the extreme right of the 1920s got up to, is nothing new, but also is never likely to go away and doesn't, on the whole, explain the development of mass constituencies of support, because these sort of rather fanciful anti-establishment views are probably always restricted to relatively small groups of activists, rather than being part of a broader pattern of the temper of democratic bottom-up politics as it's developed in Europe at different points in the 20th and 21st centuries. And I think, you know, it's clearly present today, isn't it, in the degree to which you can get very particular hard cores of activists in all sorts of sections of the political spectrum who resort to really rather strange magical ways of thinking. But that's not, to look at them is not to look at the broader basis of the what I've been trying to emphasize today, which is the fragmentation of a particular discipline democratic space and the development of much broader and rather interesting molten forms of democracy in 21st century Europe.
So in the interest of time, I think I'll just take last question and then all panelists can respond. So very fitting.
Thank you so much. I'm Sumaya. I have a Zoom question and I have my own question. I'll try to be quick. So looking historically, what is new and how definitions change? Is it populism? Is it democracy? So the end of the empire's nation building, are we witnessing a change in the political systems and the way the governing systems develop? And is the idea of the people is the steering wheel that defines which directions we will go? Is it democracy or more authoritarianism? This is my question. And the internet Zoom question is, how do populist regimes negotiate intellectual authority and legitimize their power through co-option of elite intellectuals?
Thank you. So I think what we'll do, as we've only got a few minutes left, ask each of the panelists to reply just for 1 minute to either of those, and then we've got the time because we don't want to be late for coffee.
Okay, I'll answer your the Zoom question rather than I leave others to answer the first question. So I think populist movements, as we see with figures like Steve Bannon and figures here in Oxford, have their own educated elites and seek to legitimise their movements through various programs of intellectual development. And I think one of the things that does need to be accounted for, and I'm kind of very interested in, is the creation of, as we saw with a kind of a libertarian movements like the von Mises Institute and others, the ways in which a lot of the alternative kind of para-academic institutional infrastructure that emerges from the 60s and 70s and 80s has either been kind of repurposed into legitimizing these kind of more authoritarian populist movements, or a new parallel intellectual infrastructure, giving fellowships and running institutes and summer programs and all this kind of stuff. Again, some of it is here in Oxford. And that actually, this creation then of a kind of intellectual legitimization of these kinds of frameworks, and the Curtis Yerevan would be a great example of this, a kind of discourse that is explicitly and inherently valorizing authoritarian rule as the best and most benign form of rule. I think you can see historical analogues that in the 20s and 30s. That's figures like Moran, others. But yeah, so I think they're not the kind of posing of anti-intellectual is not that itself is a kind of stance.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So in 1 minute, yeah, history I think is changing. You know, it has to. I think we're facing many crises. You know, some of them are very well. Most of them actually are undoing in various countries, in different contexts and so on. So I think history is changing whether we want it or not. I think it has to, in a way, it has to, and it can be positive. I think it can be incredibly negative. I don't know where it's going. I'm not necessarily particularly optimistic, but I know it doesn't have to be this way either. So I think it depends what we want to do with it and what the people want to do with it, right? So I think this is why the theme of the conference here is particularly important. And for the Zoom question, and I think it links to the previous question as well. I think we have to be careful again with the term populism, and I don't want I don't want there to be an op-ed tomorrow saying, but I've cancelled the term populism and Martin Conway because he used it. But I think we need to be careful again with calling it populism. Not all experts are part of the elite necessarily, right? And vice versa as well. So I think we need to be careful with that. And I think what we need to do is when we hear the term populism used in a bad faith manner, we need to think about or when we hear reactionaries trying to push certain narratives, we need to think about what interests are being protected or advanced. Why are we focusing on crazy conspiracy theories when there are, conspiracies right in front of us that have a much bigger impact on us, right? And I'm talking about blatant things like the way and it takes us back to the first question in many ways, the way our economic systems are set up that make people starve, that make people incredibly poor, the way our governments are supporting wars, the way we are putting billions into defense while some people, again, are starving, while children are failing to be able to go to school because they can't eat. So all these kind of things, right? Which interests are being defended by all these conspiracy theories that we see and that we waste so much time on, including in our mainstream press?
Okay, Martin.
Yes. The second question is an interesting one, and as Luke's indicated, is also a particular Oxford question, because it's been quite interesting how in the last 5 years you've seen the gathering around the official University of Oxford of various unofficial institutes that seek some legitimation through their association with here to develop ideas that probably are not part of the liberal mainstream that we would recognise as being the trajectory of Oxford since the Second World War. The first question is really quite important to me, because I think that this idea that we have to recognise some sort of watershed that happened in Europe somewhere between 1989 and 2008 as being the emergence of a new era of European history is one that I keep singing as a song at historical conferences, because I just know how many of the people like myself who were a product of this engagement with the project of contemporary history have now hidden from the present in favour of a study of the second half of the 20th century as being a rather protected garden of a particular form of European modernity that produced great scholarship, especially about coming to terms with fascism, collaboration, the Holocaust and all that. But to carry on doing that at a time when I think European history has moved on is a form of hiding from the present, and that's never pretty among historians.
Well, what a fantastic sentence and thought to end on. So I hope you all enjoyed this first panel. I think it has been fantastic, very well curated. Thank you. and excellent discussion. So give everyone, including yourselves, a round of applause.